Welcome to Teach, Learn, Share, a podcast that thoughtfully explores teaching and learning practices in higher ed. This podcast is brought to you by Teaching and Learning Services at McGill University. I'm Jasmine Parra. We're recording today from McGill University in Montreal, Quebec, Canada, which is on unceded land, which has long served as a site of meeting and exchange among Indigenous peoples, including the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe nations. We honor their stewardship as we live and work on these lands. So this is the second episode of our mini-series on assessment and well-being. Today we will be unpacking inclusive assessment.
Hi, I'm Margot Eckenberg. Welcome to the show. If assessment is about measuring, then what exactly do we measure? Student, their learning, how do we measure? Are the tools right to fit the task? What's being left out, unheard, made invisible, unintentionally excluded in our assessment practices? Today, we'll be talking about inclusive assessment, which Hawkins has defined as the design and use of fair and effective assessment methods and practices that enable all students to demonstrate to their full potential what they know, understand, and can do. The goal, in other words, is to assure all students equitable opportunities to learn from assessment and to be equitably judged within an assessment. Instructors and students bring their identities and cultures into the classroom environment. Our beliefs and values impact the decisions we make as we teach, including how we assess and grade our students' work. Courses in higher ed are never just about the content and are never neutral. What we choose to teach and what we want our students to walk away with from the experience are not objective acts of knowledge transference removed from context, places, identities. Grading and giving feedback can be two of the most critical sites of inequities because they're so deeply linked to educational outcomes and students' sense of self. They can also be imbued with implicit bias, including assumptions about students having characteristics or abilities that are not among those being assessed. In this episode, we will discuss why traditional assessment strategies can affect students unequally, favoring some over others. We will also explore some assessment strategies that seek to effectively support all students while upholding academic rigor.
To help us navigate these topics and lead the dialogue today, we've invited Char Lewis-Sutherland to the podcast. Many of us know Charlene as Char. Char is the Senior Advisor of Faculty Development and Inclusive Pedagogy here at McGill, and they have over 15 years of experience working in the field of higher education. Their areas of focus are on anti-racist and inclusive pedagogies in hiring, equity, and advising on socially just research and assessment. So Char has contributed to research teams that have investigated racial microaggressions in the classroom, the needs of Black students in academia, feminism and anti-oppression in publishing, as well as the social sustainability of teaching and learning practices in higher ed specifically. Their work is informed by their study of feminism, queer theory, social justice, gender studies, and critical race theory. Char works really hard to make campuses more equitable and navigable for underrepresented communities. Given their extensive experience in equity and anti-racism teaching and learning and inclusive pedagogies, we really couldn't think of anybody better to join us today. We're really excited to have Char on the show to talk about assessment and well-being from their perspective.
Hello. Hello, Margot, Jasmine. Thank you for having me. I'm very excited to be here. Those who know me know that I love to talk about assessment. And my love of it is actually kind of a funny one. It came from a number of different avenues, different places, areas where I became interested in assessment. But very specifically, I was part of a team of people who were doing some work. And there was an instrument that was being used to evaluate something. And the thing that we were evaluating, I personally don't believe could be easily captured using like a Likert scale. And that's what we were using, but we used it anyways. And I remember thinking, gosh, that doesn't seem to make sense. And so I started to get a little interested. I had an opportunity to go to ACPA, which is the American College Personnel Association yearly conference in 2018, where I was able to meet Gavin Henning and Anne Lundquist and some other thought leaders who were thinking about assessment from kind of different perspectives and thinking about, well, what does it look like to move towards assessment that can be a tool to perhaps foster equity? And so I thought that was a really radical dialogue, and that got me really interested. Beyond that, actually, I was seeing, or something that I have observed was statistically insignificant data being overlooked when it was clear that the experiences of people who are on the fringe, so like a small portion of a small portion, were people who were underrepresented, who were under listened to, and underheard. And so for me, understanding the experiences of underrepresented voices actually drew me to be interested in qualitative data and a way of promoting perhaps people who are having experiences of marginalization.
Thanks so much for sharing that, Char. I think that it's really important to personalize a relationship with assessment because we tend to see it as something, as you say, something qualitative and also somehow external to us and to the way we interact as colleagues, peers, or in the instructor-student relationship on university campuses. So in that spirit, I thought that perhaps before talking about inclusive assessment in the teaching and learning relationship directly, I'm wondering if you can speak to this notion of engendering a culture of assessment on a university campus first. So what would that entail? And why should we be thinking in those terms?
Yeah, thank you. I think that we need a kind of a collective shift away from the idea of thinking about assessment and evaluation as something that's pejorative, something that's maybe like merely like a survey and then a report, which I'm not saying are necessarily bad, but they're really not the whole story. And I think assessment can be a story. It can be a way of like looking at where you are and mapping out where you want to go, and then allowing people to help co-create that roadmap for how they want to get there. And then, lastly, I want to say that it doesn't necessarily have to lead to sanctions, right? A survey and a report on what we're doing poorly and then potentially sanction. I think actually assessment can be a form, or it can be a way to showcase things that we're already doing or things that we're doing well. And so when we get out from behind this like binary, I think we can get creative and we can engender a culture where we're more critically curious and engaged. I know recently there were a lot of conversations around how we're going into our next century. And I really think something that's extremely important is having our histories in mind, because, at the time when some of these institutions were built, including McGill, the funds that were able to be levied to create and to build these buildings were gained through the trafficking of enslaved persons, including McGill, including James McGill, who was involved in that trade as well. I think acknowledging that history is part of that roadmap, right? Like that's where we were and thinking about where we want to go. And we do need to actually look at our full selves and even the parts that are that we might not be proud of, because they may inform actually how things are happening at the present. So Christina Sharp and Sadie Hartman are two scholars, and they write so eloquently about like the hangover of slavery and how we're still living in a hangover. And that hangover informs like the structures that, were built at the time, right? So thinking about our institutions, the ways of not just testing and measuring people, but some of those disciplines as well too are mired in that hangover of really previously really horrendous, sites of oppression. And, how can we reflect on those things and learn from them so that we're creating futures that look different? And how can we reflect on how those things have informed our present practices? So I think when I think of assessment as like a roadmap and a culture of assessment, I think it means really coming full circle and like looking at the landscape and learning from our past and using that to help chart our future.
I really appreciate what you said, because it helps us also to widen the lens. I think something that happens in teaching and learning practices a great deal is that we're very inward looking, both from the instructor perspective and the student perspective. It tends to be, my courses and my roadmap and what I need to do. And with much less of a sense of how tied not only the micro is to the macro, but all of those shades in between, like all of the different practices that are happening, in order to be able to have a better sense of what it means to actually carry out assessment on the one hand, right? To really widen our lens. And as you say, bring in not only a departmental level, a faculty level, a university level, but as you say, those same structures, but historically as well, right? So looking backwards to understand now to prepare better for the future. And I think the one other thing I wanted to pull out of what you've said, at least at this point of our conversation, is how this negative view of assessment, it seems to be, right? I liked it very much when you say it doesn't have to be sanction driven. It doesn't have to be what are we doing wrong necessarily, but also this idea of I don't want to be assessed, or I don't want to do assessment. We hear over and over in the higher ed context, I love teaching, but I hate the grading, or I want someone else to grade for me, or wouldn't it be great if the grading could just happen, as if somehow they're divorced from each other, when they're not at all. Assessment should be this integral way of our teaching practice, where we think this is how I want to know where the learning is happening and where the focus has to be placed. But also this notion that assessment is carried out throughout the higher education world constantly. We're constantly being evaluated, and that we can think of how those different practices also have lines of communication amongst them.
When we're talking about assessment being something that is kind of has these stressful associations to it, it reminds me of when I first started in this position a few years ago. I was just freshly out of school as a student, transitioning to a professional career. And I attended the course design workshop for the first time, and it was kind of just to observe how things were done at TLS. It was an event that was put on by TLS. And one of the first activities in the workshop that was done was a word cloud, where instructors were asked to write what their first thought was when they heard the word assessment. And the word cloud was built, and it was all like stress, and it was all like negative things. And so it kind of was the first time that I saw from an instructor's perspective that it also has a negative association on their side as well. So it's not just students' well-being. And I know we're going to be talking about well-being in general associated to assessment. We're largely focusing on students, but it's important to also acknowledge that on the instructor's side, from their perspective, it's also become something quite stressful. So I really liked the idea that you said earlier, Char, and Margot, you touched on it, where assessment doesn't have to be just looking at the things that are wrong and the things that need improvement, but also celebrating the things that are going right in the learning process. So I think that that's really important to consider when we think about assessment. Can you walk us through the relationship between implicit bias and assessment, where it crops up, and how it can negatively impact certain students? And maybe just to make sure that we're all on the same page, let's start with what implicit bias is and why it's relevant in higher ed contexts.
There are a lot of thought leaders who will talk about bias and assessment, but I want to say something that we're part of an educational legacy, right? So we're thinking about who taught me, who taught them. You might be part of a disciplinary legacy, right? So, the history of the field that you're in, whatever you're studying, whatever you're a part of. And, through those different ways, you can see that, you developed ways of thinking or ways of making arguments or ways of gathering data. And I'm not saying that this is bad. In fact, this just is. This is what it is. And it's likely specific to your discipline and your colleagues. So in other fields, people are engaging in different methodologies and different epistemologies, different ways of knowing. So with all of that in mind, all of those choices, all of those different ways that we're socialized, the different teachers that we've had, the different political context in which certain knowledge has emerged, it's clear that we're constructing knowledge in a certain way. And this is where I want to talk about not necessarily biases as being something inherently pejorative, but just recognizing that, we're constructing it in a very particular way. So to address bias in assessment, you first need to understand or hopefully bring awareness to the fact that we're part of these systems. We're part of a series of choices. And sometimes the ways in which the methods or methodologies exist go unexamined. It can go unexamined sometimes for years, maybe even decades. And so my argument is, given that we now know more about student development, more about student learning, more about brains, more about diverse ways of thinking, more about epistemologies, more about epistemicide, more about achievement gaps, as well as the increasing diversity of the student body, it stands to reason that we would need to, pause and really rethink our methods and methodologies and see, is someone being unfairly advantaged? Is someone being unintentionally excluded? Thinking about these metrics that we've established and, just reflecting on all of those things and saying, does this still work? Does this still serve?
I would add to that too, Char, that I think when we bring that into our practice, we can think about how there's so many decisions that we don't actively make. Like, I think that the metacognition that you were talking about is partly it's absent, and it's partly absent because it's not encouraged when you're formed in a discipline, especially if you have graduate studies. The assumption is that you are already a successful candidate in the system, the way the system works, right? So to begin to unpack the system and understand it more thoroughly has to be a very conscientious decision, which is certainly happening in many, many disciplines, and in others it's not. I think that's the sort of the state we're at now. But the very fact that we can have these conversations already talks about what has changed. and also what has not changed. And I think it's really interesting how the tools seem to be often the last to go. And I don't know if there's a connection there with what we were talking about earlier, and sort of these negative ideas or negative associations that Jasmine pointed out as well. I think all three of us have about the negative connotation with assessment and the slow change to the tools that we use, as if there wasn't a disconnect, which there is, right? I mean, we can see a curriculum expanding in order to include other voices in many contexts, but the tools that are being used to assess student learning are going to remain very, very traditional. And that isn't being questioned somehow. It's sort of, well, that's how we do things. So maybe we can shift now to talk about some strategies that we can think about introducing into the classroom to support all students. And we can engage there too with this notion of, is it true that the way we actually assess our students' learning is what's changing most slowly? So a couple of strategies I wanted to bring up initially would be thinking about strategies related to clarity and flexibility. So with that, I'm making reference, for example, to using clear instructions to express to student how grades are earned, using rubrics to be able to share criteria ahead of time with students so that they know what elements of an assignment are going to be assessed. Formative feedback, so feedback that will really allow students to improve, not only sort of receive a grade on an assignment, but also to get feedback that would help them improve and be able to continue in a certain direction. And then when we talk about flexibility, we might be referring to things like choice of assignments, right? So we have the same kind of learning outcome. The outcome or the objective for the student is the same, but the way to get there can be a choice for a student, maybe something like dropping a lowest grade, flexible submission dates, which takes into account the whole person and not just the student, understanding that everyone will have moments in the term where they most likely will need a little bit more time. So these are all understood as strategies that support students clearly. But to what degree are these also equitable and anti-racist strategies?
Yeah, so thank you for that. I think that those are great suggestions and strategies, and some that I've seen or even been participated in myself, and I see the connections as being kind of multiple-fold. You're inviting the students to take an active role in their learning for some of these, and that will support self-efficacy. This is what the literature is showing us. If we're inviting student participation, we're then acknowledging, not just to the student, but to others, that students are stakeholders in their learning, right? And that can drive them to be more engaged and invested. It also allows us to kind of co-create the definition of success with the students in mind. And this will allow us to be more culturally responsive. And so in this way, you're recognizing that maybe certain methods privilege some over others. And, people have numerous educational paths, but what you might see in a given class is constructed in a very specific way. So some of the strategies that you just named are kind of like saying, hey, let's not assume that every student might understand or communicate in this way. The way that this method was constructed was done so with X persons in mind, and it disadvantages Y students right now. And so some of that is also a reflection on, just the environment that we have, and reflection on, well, that there are barriers that exist in this classroom, and what are they? Part of an anti-racist educational perspective is to acknowledge that racism does exist in these structures, just as it does outside, right? So it's not necessarily to say that higher ed is a privileged space where nothing that happens in the rest of the world happens on campus, right? So it's saying, well, if there are systems that are existing outside of the world, that there are ways of operating or ways of privileging outside of the world, maybe that happens on our campus too. And some of that has been acknowledged in some of the strategic plans and imperatives that we do have on campus that name certain histories and certain, ways of being on this campus that we're actually moving away from and towards. And so, kind of starting with some of these assumptions in mind. Okay, so this is what exists. Now what? Well, how do we challenge that? And so that's where some of these reflections on the strategies, how we do what we do, I think is what allows for a more equitable and anti-racist intervention. So, and I just want to name something that you mentioned previously about clarity and flexibility. I also think some of these points and some of these strategies also support, not only are they culturally responsive, but they're also potentially supportive of different ways, different learners. So it may support neurodiversity in the classroom if people have a way to kind of remove the assumptions through use of a rubric where, we understand exactly where we are and where we're going.
Hey, I really liked the way you answered that, because I think that absolutely, right? We see all of the folds, and yet And yet these are conversations that they're either not happening or they're happening in sort of disconnected ways. And so I'm excited that today we have this chance to really just put some of the pieces together. And I'm going to pull in again this notion of a healthier learning environment that we talk about as an ideal, but we're not always very explicit about how do we get there? What's the path? What's the roadway to get there? And I think, as you've been laying out for us today, assessment can serve as this kind of narrative and a path of how we want to trace the way we're working at so many different levels at the higher education level. I wanted to talk a little bit more about criterion reference grading. Traditionally, sort of the binary is criterion reference versus norm reference. So norm reference would be when students are assessed according to where they fall in terms of their peers. And criterion reference grading or assessment, it shares the criteria with the student, or at least ideally the student knows the criteria ahead of time, not always the case. But the idea is that the student's work is being evaluated against a pre-established set of criteria. Ideally, you mentioned alignment at one point, Char. We know we'd want the course to be designed with learning outcomes in mind, and then the criteria would reflect those learning outcomes. And then looking at the student's work, we say, okay, yes, this is matching up to the criteria, or we're seeing a gap that has to be addressed. So norm reference grading, so grading students on a curve, we're measuring them against their peers. The literature tells us that this has been shown to exacerbate racial disparities. So the shift towards criterion reference grading is a good one. And I'm asking you to affirm that, why you think that this is also an important shift. In other words, if the criteria is clearly expressed, for example, in a well-designed rubric, are we addressing some of the disparities that we've been mentioning in today's show? And is this enough to apply a similar standard across multiple individuals if we have tools like this? Or should other things be happening on the part of both instructors and students to assure the kind of learning that we want?
Yeah, thank you. I wanted to address something that you said previously about healthy learning environments. And this is a bit of a hypothetical question, but can you have a healthy learning environment where racism is being upheld? Can you have a healthy learning environment where you're not challenging racism or racist behaviors? So I would argue that perhaps you can't. So to think about, some of the tenets of anti-racism education is to support that healthy learning environment, support a learning environment where students aren't worried about stereotype threat and how that interacts with not just the way they're going to interact with you, but then their peers as well too. And then to come to the point around, you mentioned about expectation management. And this is where I think there's something super interesting, why I think rubrics are not enough, but really important, is that, for example, asking a question about an assignment or something that you're doing that you might not know, well, not every student actually understands what office hours are. Not every student understands that the office hours are for them versus the professor. So when I say, thinking about perhaps a lens that you're going to use, into Jasmine's point, in other areas of teaching strategies, it could look like, recognizing other things that students might need to succeed, equitably have a chance to succeed in your course. It could be, naming the expectations, also naming the tools that you have, the resources that are there for them and how they can use them. So, talking about office hours and letting students know. And once again, this comes back to pushing back on these assumptions that folks should know. We have, students who are first generation students here who might not know what it is like to navigate the higher education system, who might not know what it's like to have a relationship with a prof or to speak with a prof. We also might have students who come from a space or area or a background where speaking with a professor or someone who's in that position of power might not be normalized. So, kind of having this more holistic approach and actually attuning the lens around equity to more than just, assessment practices, I think can support student success and student learning, because it's kind of pushing past these assumptions that we might have, and also becoming better versed in what students are naming as the barriers as well. I also want to say that I think anything that allows for clarity and criterion is welcome for me. As I mentioned previously, there can be a lot of assumptions in the campus, in the classroom, particularly in norm referenced grading, as you've mentioned before. What someone thinks is inherent or should be understood is very culturally specific, not to mention temporally specific. So these things can actually change over time. And giving people a criterion, that can mean that, we're not moving the goalpost, so to speak. You're giving learners a chance to understand what they might need to succeed. And depending on the instrument or the rubric or what have you, it can show you maybe the scaffolding. So what we might need to build upon to get to that place of success. And I do believe that this is the power to limit bias, as you mentioned earlier, and particularly when it comes to, as we talked about, aligning your outcomes with your strategies, right? So we're limiting bias because we're bringing to our own awareness what we want what we're looking to evaluate, what learning looks like, and then perhaps sharing that with the students as well. And not every instructor has actually engaged in that exercise around, what are the outcomes that I want to have for this course and how is it tied to the assessment methods? And I think that can be some of the reason why, you may get pushback or stress around that, is because perhaps in lack of alignment, it's becoming an issue. I'm not suggesting that it is, but, there could be a myriad of reasons why people might not necessarily be excited to engage in assessment. And, engendering a culture of assessment hopefully would be, looking like bring more joy into that space. So it's less of a stressor and more of a way to, to celebrate like good pedagogy or celebrate student success.
I like that you mentioned joy at the end, because I think that, breaking with this notion, right, that there's certain parts of a teaching practice that couldn't possibly be joyful or that couldn't possibly be fulfilling. And I'm generalizing here, but I think there is a lot of, we're not having that conversation around assessment. It's not seen as something that could potentially produce those kinds of feelings. And yet, what more can instructors ask for than the students learn what we want them to learn, right? And also the satisfaction that gives the students themselves. So it really is, I think, an important sort of call to action on our part to be thinking more in those terms and breaking patterns. I think a lot of our conversation has been thinking about ways of taking on harmful patterns and thinking that they can be reworked, rewritten, engaged in different ways. I think that that's one of the huge benefits of thinking about different epistemologies, different ways of learning. And it can also bring us to think about, right, joined with the metacognition, it brings us to this idea of let's do things differently. Let's take things apart and also change the discourse.
So we've talked a lot about more general practices and general strategies today, but we know that teaching context is very important and key. So examples might not always be universal. They still might be inspiring and thought-provoking, but I would really love to hear, Char, if you could share an example of an inclusive assessment practice that you really like in particular.
A practice that really inspires me is a professed belief in a student's ability to succeed. This year, I was lucky enough to work with a professor who, along with her co-instructor, decided to let their first-year chemistry students know that chemistry is hard, but they believe that their students can succeed, they can be successful. And it was a small statement that was on their syllabi, but I feel like it was important and impactful. So what we know from the literature is that, some students may not understand that being challenged in a course might be natural or a normal part of higher ed and learning. And so some students may take it as a sign that X discipline is not for them. X institution is not for them, right? And you mix that with maybe the dearth of underrepresented persons in that discipline or field, and this hypothetical student may leave the institution, the discipline, perhaps even higher ed, I don't know. But how does this relate to assessment? Well, there's something called a wise feedback framing statement, and I'll make sure that link is in your show notes. But the statement draws from the principle that I just mentioned about that professed belief in a student's ability to succeed. And I think it can be especially supportive for students whose identity may be underrepresented and who may be less accustomed to, how things may be on a college campus in an institution. So a wise feedback framing statement supports rigor by communicating that you as an instructor have appropriately challenging standards for student work. It also allows you an opportunity to declare that you think a student can succeed. And it includes actionable feedback that a student can actually use and apply. When I say actionable feedback, it's something concrete. So it's feedback on something that they can actually do versus something that they can't actually change and, maybe perceived as more of a criticism than feedback itself. But this wise feedback framing statement and the idea of professing a belief in a student's ability to succeed, to me, that's something that I'm really appreciating and finding a lot of joy in this year.
I really love that example that you shared, especially because it's one that takes no time, like no time at all to plan and implement. So thank you. That's very cool. And it's really, I just really think comes down to, and I know we've said this in other episodes, but humanizing the whole teaching and learning process and just making it a lot more holistic. Like chemistry is hard, physics is hard. They're really hard, but I think it's important to support students in saying that, you can do hard things, and together the instructor and the student can move through that process together. So I think it's really cool that you brought up that example.
And so can I actually just add to that?
Yeah.
Especially as we're talking about healthier learning environments, I think something that in my mind, or at least for me personally, that supports that is a recognition that often we're dealing with like the epistemic in classes, right? So like knowledge and knowledge production, but people aren't floating brains, they're in bodies, they have experiences, histories, past, et cetera. So they're bringing their whole selves, they're bringing their affective selves, their ontological selves into the classroom environment. So I think a healthier learning environment, to my mind, is one that takes those into account as well as the epistemic, that recognizes that, they might have feelings and feelings about something, might get dysregulated over something. And so, just thinking about the student as more of that whole person. So to Jasmine's point, like more holistically thinking about, your whole self, as opposed to just thinking about just that brain, that floating brain that is actually in a person, who might have feelings and who might be experiencing challenges, which you might be unaware. And so, kind of that awareness building to me is really first and foremost central. Like, how can I build individual awareness around myself, my educational path and history, and how it affects the work that I do and the teaching that I do. And what do I know about students who are typically challenged in this course, or students who aren't doing so well, and what their challenges might be? What can I learn about, hey, in this field, in this discipline, or even in this department, what are some of the barriers that students have named? What are the things that people are noticing? And so how you kind of create a departmental awareness. And then also within your own field, what are the histories that will make it challenging for someone to engage with some of this work? There are some disciplines that are engaged in a number of different practices. I don't want to point anything out right now on the spot, but what is the history of my discipline, and how can I bring awareness to that, and how that actually might come out in the course and my lesson plans, and affect students as well too. So that awareness building, I think, is also part of that healthier learning environment.
I want to thank you again, Char, for sharing all your insights with us. It's been great.
It's been really valuable to have you on today and to see this topic through your lens. So you've given us a lot to think about. I hope you've given our listeners a lot to think about as well. Before we wrap up, is there anything that you weren't able to touch on today that you'd like to add? Feel free to share anything, an important takeaway. It might be maybe a tip or a piece of media that you think people should engage with, articles, books, films, whatever it may be, that you'd like to recommend to our listeners before we end today.
So it's housed on Anthology. Anthology.com is a higher ed website. They do have a space for resources. And there were a few assessment conversations that, as I mentioned, Gavin Henning and Lundquist engaged in with folks from NILOA, which is the National Institute for Learning Outcomes and Assessment. So there's some podcasts on that around, kind of bridging assessment with equity that I actually think are pretty worthwhile and could be cool to listen to. Additionally, speaking of NILOA, the National Institute for Learning Outcomes and Assessment, Jankowski and Montenegro have a white paper on equity and assessment. They won in 2017, I think, and one in 2020. And I think those are really interesting reads in terms of, kind of expanding thoughts around and equitable assessments.
Thanks so much, Char, for the really awesome resources. They seem to be, or they sound to be, in line with everything we've discussed today. So I'm really excited to check them out, as I'm sure our listeners. Thank you so much again for being here. And thank you, everybody, for listening and tuning in. Be sure to check out or look out for our next episode of Teach, Learn, Share, where we continue to discuss assessment, equity, and well-being from different perspectives in the higher education context. Please subscribe to this podcast and share it with your colleagues, with your family, with your friends. And until next time.